Kami lumalaban sa kawayan ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan. Aming layunin, paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawayan ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, sagisag at ningning ng kalayaan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan. Aming layunin, paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawayan ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan. Aming layunin, paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawayan ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, sagisag at ningning ng kalayaan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan.
Is entitled The Philippines Youth Movement Then and Now. And our resident speaker, as usual, is the chairperson emeritus of the International League of People's Struggles, Professor Jose Maria Sison. So help me welcome Professor Sison this afternoon. Magandang hapon. Good afternoon po, Professor Sison.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the welcome. And I would like to greet you and all our listeners. More power in the struggle against the U.S.-directed Duterte fascist regime.
Okay, thank you. So fasten your seatbelt, everybody. I hope you are seated well. And I hope Professor Sison is warm enough this cold season here in Europe. We are now going to start. Professor Sison, first, we would like to ask you a brief history of the Philippine Youth Movement, particularly the Kabataang Makabayan, or the nationalist youth movement in the Philippines, that you started way back 1960s?
Batang Magkabayan was founded on November 30, 1964, the 101st birth anniversary of Andres Bonifacio. It was constituted as a comprehensive youth organization of students and young workers, peasants, teachers, and other professionals. It aimed to continue the unfinished Philippine Revolution that had been started by Andres Bonifacio in 1896. At the same time, it adopted the general line or program of new democratic revolution under the class leadership of the proletariat, in consonance with the era of modern imperialism and the world proletarian revolution. Conscious preparations for the establishment of the KM were started in 1961 when activists of the Student Cultural Association of the University of the Philippines decided to promote the organization of new democratic study groups in universities in downtown Manila and nationwide, in trade unions associated with Lapiang Manggagawa, and in barrios where the Malayang Samahan ng mga Magsasaka existed. By 1964, the founders of the KM decided that there was already a sufficient ideological, political, and organizational basis to form the KM. The KM became the most outstanding Filipino youth organization in propagating national democratic education, in increasing its nationwide membership, and in carrying out militant anti-imperialist and anti-feudal mass protests from 1964 to 1972. It initiated mass protests against the pro-imperialist and anti-democratic policies of the Marcos regime and school administrations. It joined the worker strikes and peasant mass actions. It carried out the omnibus protest against the unequal treaties with U.S. imperialism in 1965 and became a key organization in the formation of the Anti-Imperialist United Front, the movement for the advancement of nationalism in 1966. It spearheaded the October 24th movement of 1966, which promoted the mass integration of the student youth in rural and urban poor communities, joined the transport workers in protesting the oil price hikes in 1969, carried out the first water storm of 1970 and the Diliman Commune of 1971, and launched large mass actions in solidarity with the Vietnamese struggle against the U.S. war of aggression. It raised the call for people's war when Marcos suspended the writ of habeas corpus in 1971 and declared nationwide martial law in 1972. Forced to go underground, the KM became a major founder of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines and assisted the CPP and the NPA in making nationwide the People's Democratic Revolution through People's War. It played a major role in strengthening and advancing the armed revolution and eventually causing the downfall of the Marcos fascist dictatorship in 1986. It has persevered in the underground to serve as the reliable receptacle and trainer of the youth who joined the revolutionary underground and are being prepared for assignment as cadres and fighters of the new People's Army.
Thank you so much, Professor Sison. So, by the way, what were the reasons the KM was conceived at the time?
The Kabataang Magkabayan was conceived of to continue the unfinished revolution that Andres Bonifacio had started in 1896 in order to achieve national independence and democracy against Spanish colonialism and local reaction. At the same time, we, the founders of KM, were conscious that global and national conditions had changed, that we could no longer adopt in toto the principles and program of the old bourgeois democratic revolution led by the liberal bourgeoisie, but that we needed to carry out the new democratic revolution led by the proletariat in the era of modern imperialism and the world proletarian revolution. We adopted the program of new democratic revolution for the national and social liberation of the Filipino people against U.S. imperialism and the local exploiting classes of big compradors, landlords, and bureaucrat capitalists. We consider the KM as the assistant and youth trainer of the revolutionary proletariat. The class leadership of the revolution belongs to the proletariat as the most advanced, productive, and political force. It is reliant on the worker-peasant alliance, seeks to win over the alliance of the petty bourgeoisie and the middle bourgeoisie, and takes advantage of the splits among the reactionary upper classes. The revolution has a socialist perspective and is guided by the theory and practice of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism.
So who were the personalities of Kabataang Makabayan at the time when it started, and how strong was KM in terms of forces and membership relative to the archipelagic state of the country and or the massive educational institutions all over the Philippines?
After the successful demonstration of 5,000 UP students against the Committee on Anti-Filipino Activities to defend academic freedom and civil liberties against the anti-communist witch hunt on March 15, 1961, we who belong to the Student Cultural Association of the University of the Philippines decided to build student organizations similar to ours in downtown universities and in Manila, and to use national student conferences to encourage students in the provinces to do likewise. Also, for the purpose of organizing a comprehensive youth organization like the KM, we decided to approach the Lapiang Manggagawa in 1961 and the Malayang Samahan ng mga magsasaka in 1962 to offer our assistance in doing research, holding seminars, and conducting social investigation and mass work. By 1964, we already had initial groups of the KM, mainly in Metro Manila universities, in the trade unions linked to Lapiang Manggagawa, and in a number of barrios in Central Luzon and Southern Tagalog regions, where the Masaka had chapters. We founded the KM on November 30, 1964, with only some 80 charter members attending and representing the students and the young workers, peasants, teachers, and other professionals. Those elected as members of the KM National Council may be considered as the key personalities of the KM just before, during, and soon after the founding. The core of these personalities belonged to the old Communist Party, but were already adherents of Marxist-Leninist ideas against modern revisionism. After the KM founding, we formally enrolled as KM members by the hundreds and then by the thousands from year to year nationwide because of the high prestige of KM as a resolute and militant anti-imperialist and democratic youth organization, and because of the highly visible campaigns of political education and protest mass actions that it carried out. The KM played a key role in helping the CPP and NPA become nationwide organizations from 1968 onwards. At the time that Marcos declared martial law and outlawed the KM, this had already a national membership of 15,000 to 20,000, most of whom joined the revolutionary underground and many of whom joined the CPP and the NPA to strengthen these as nationwide organizations. Since 1973, the KM has been a major component of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines.
So what do you consider as the strategic impact of KM as representation of the voice of the Filipino youth?
From its founding in 1964 to its illegalization in 1972, the KM was the most outstanding legal comprehensive youth organization advocating the National Democratic Program and generating the National Democratic Movement, not only in the youth sector, but also in other major sectors of Philippine society. It took up national issues and international issues against U.S. imperialism. It was a major force in denouncing and condemning U.S. domination of the Philippines and the puppetry of the reactionary classes and their political agents, as well as the U.S. wars of aggression and military intervention in Indochina and elsewhere. From 1972 onward, as an underground revolutionary force, the KM persevered in fighting the Marcos fascist dictatorship and helping to build the CPP, NPA, NDFP, and the local organs of political power as instruments of the People's Democratic Revolution nationwide. It was a major force in building the mass movement in order to overthrow the Marcos fascist dictatorship in 1986. Since then, it has continued to stay in the underground as a major force of the NDFP in order to keep going the People's Democratic Revolution through protracted People's War. It makes sure that the youth continues to rejuvenate the armed revolution from generation to generation.
So what do you consider as the best or the peak of the achievements of the Kabataang Makabayan, professors?
I think that the KM achieved its peaks of strength in every period of its existence. In the period of 1964 to 1972, it peaked with the first quarter storm of 1970 and with the mass protests calling for people's war against the Marcos threat of martial law. Then, in the period of 1973 to 86, its thousands of activists who were forced to go underground joined and strengthened the CPP and the NPA nationwide. Consequently, the crisis of the ruling system worsened and persuaded the US to jump the Marcos fascist regime in 1984 to 1986, especially after the 1983 assassination of Aquino. Until now, the KM is a formidable underground organization because it serves as an effective receptacle and distributor of the youth from the urban and rural areas who wish to join the armed revolution as cadres and red fighters.
So do you consider KM as a decisive youth movement against the dictatorship at the time of Marcos? Why?
Oh, yes, of course. The youth in the urban and rural areas were inspired by the revolutionary program and militancy of the KM and by the prominence of KM alumni and veterans as the leaders of the CPP, NPA, and NDFP, uh, and even in the anti-Marcos groups of the conservative forces. There were KM veterans there, even while the KM was already underground during the Marcos dictatorship. The KM was well known as an effective and decisive engine of the revolutionary movement all throughout the time of the Marcos fascist dictatorship. Until now, the KM is known to be playing a decisive role in the NDFP and in the People's Democratic Revolution. The role of the KM was very conspicuous because the conservative anti-Marcos movement involving the upper classes weakened, no? It was actually the revolutionary movement with KM as a very active force, continuing and strengthening the anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, and anti-feudal movement.
Okay, so thank you so much. How has KM affected or created an impact to the masses in terms of imagery and advocacy in the political, economic, and social milieu?
The KM has a large impact on the masses in terms of imagery and advocacy in the political, economic, and social milieu because to this day, the imagery of the heroism and militancy of the KM is shown in documentary photos, narratives, and artworks, and the advocacy of the KM is well expressed in its constitution and program, its periodic and timely statements on issues, and the books and declarations. The national democratic principles and program of the KM continue to resound in the declarations and actions of all forces of the national democratic movement. And the entire Filipino people know that the People's Democratic Revolution has arisen and advanced because of the KM and its contributions in arousing, organizing, and mobilizing the youth and the oppressed toiling masses.
Yeah, okay. Do you consider KM as still relevant and effective in the ensuing years? How and why?
The KM is still relevant and effective until now, even if you look at KM as a historical force that you might tend to limit to the 1964 to 1972 in its legal existence. Its exemplary role, even only within such period, is exemplary, inspirational, and relevant. And it is definitely relevant because the semi-colonial and semi-feudal character of the Philippine ruling system persists. The KM was previously faced by the evil forces of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. To this day, the Filipino youth and people are faced with the same problems in ever monstrous proportions.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that, Professor. Our last question. Do you consider KM as still relevant today and tomorrow? How and why?
There is much to learn from the history, theory, program, actions, methods, and achievements of the KM until now. The KM is still relevant today and will be for some time to come as we strive to accomplish the People's Democratic Revolution. Even after this revolution is basically completed and we are in the stage of the socialist revolution, it will still be relevant and useful to learn from the historical role and experience of the KM in order to honor our revolutionary predecessors and celebrate the revolutionary spirit, heroic efforts, and achievements in the service of the Filipino people.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Sison. We are finished in the first part, so we'll have a short break to entertain questions from the audience. This is Professor Sanchez, Phoebe Sanchez, here at the Radcliffe Hall of College Alberto Grande of the Université Catholique de Louvain. And we'll have a short break to wait for the questions from the audience.
Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagaw at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan, aming layunin paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asenderong salgang bayan, kami lumalaban sa kawil ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagaw at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan, aming layunin paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asenderong salgang bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawil ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, sa gisag at ningning ng kalayaan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagaw at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan, aming layunin paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asenderong salgang bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawil ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng mga pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan, aming layunin paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawil ng bayan, mapanglabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan, aming layunin paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawil ng bayan, mapanglabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, sagisag at ningning ng kalayaan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan, aming layunin paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawil ng bayan, mapanglabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan, aming layunin paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawil ng bayan, mapanglabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, sagisag at ningning ng kalayaan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan. Aming layunin, paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawin ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, sagisag at ningning ng kalayaan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, apoy ng pagkakaisang walang hanggan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan. Aming layunin, paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan. Kami lumalaban sa kawin ng bayan, mapangabing kapitalistang dayuhan. Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag-asa ng buong bayan, sa lungsod at sa mga lalawigan. Aming layunin, paunlarin ang ating bayan, ibagsak ang asinderong sal ng bayan.
Okay, yan ang kabataang makabayan, parang apoy na nagliliyab na patuloy. Okay? So let's go back now to the second part of our episode, the Philippine Youth Movement Then and Now. We have a set of 4 questions that we would like to ask our Professor Emeritus of the International League of People's Struggles, Professor Jose Maria Sison. So the first question, was there a standard age for the membership of KM when it started? And how do you compare this with the Duterte Youth Group now?
Well, the standard age was from 15 to 30 at first. Then in the second Congress, we raised the maximum age limit to 35. So that was that standard stood for the longest time, from 15 to 35.
Okay, how do you compare this to Duterte's group?
The Duterte's group, I know how it was formed exactly. By this former PMA cadet who was expelled from PMA when he wrote in the social media in Facebook against the killing of his uncle, no? A lawyer, Attorney Capulong, who was murdered by the military. And so he used to write to me when he was when he grew some horns on his head against the PMA. And then his group was a small one, even when he was
Maliit lang pala.
even when he was waving the correct banner, or let us say he would use progressive slogans. his group was small, and when the group became reactionary, all people, were presented as youth members of the group. And I know how this group was financed. It was financed to support Duterte, and it was for that narrow purpose. And then this guy expected high positions uh, in the Duterte regime. So it's a poison kind of group, from the beginning. It's not
Yeah,
it's not well
personality
motivated by
oriented.
service to the people.
Yeah. Okay. Were there other organizations also parallel at the time? And how do you compare the other organizations to Kabataang Makabayan in the 1960s or the 1970s?
Well, you see, KM is now underground. It is an illegalized organization. It cannot come out without being chased and hunted down by the intelligence agencies and all these killer groups of Duterte. No, so but the group that has learned how to fight the legal way, and who has which has already a long tradition since the late 1990s. Anak Bayan is the best legal national democratic organization. Now, I'm praising it. No, these idiots in the military might use that as they might say, "Oh,
Yeah.
it's season red tagging." The stupid ones. Uh, these
Okay.
stupid people, who would use every hint of praising good legal forces, in the service of the people, as something very, very wrong. And these are reactionary forces whose loyalty is not to the Filipino nation, but to the imperialist powers that are dominant, and to the local exploiting classes. Anyway, the most resolute and militant and successful comprehensive youth organization waging uh, comprehensive legal national democratic struggle is Anak Bayan. Anak Bayan, Europe, is a part of that great
Okay.
youth
Thank you
organization,
for Anak Bayan.
which is now
Yeah, okay.
being
Thank you for
threatened
Anak
by
Bayan.
legalization.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor. Next question. In your assessment, did red tagging affect the membership of Kilusang, Kabataang Makabayan at that time? Did it affect the membership of KM at the time? Or was it also was it very difficult to recruit members?
No, the red tagging, the KM stood up, against the witch hunt, and it has a background, of Scout leaders fighting against the witch hunt done by the Committee on Anti-Filipino Activities, of the lower house, using the anti-subversion law. So there's that background, and the militancy and coherency in the principles and program of the KM precisely attracted support, and the red tagging helped,
All the more.
yes, the youth to see that the enemies of the people are really furious against the KM, so they become more eager to join the KM. That was the same pattern showed during the time of the Scout. Many, Scout was only 25 to 30 members. Huh? At the time, but they included the best and the brightest. They included the Scout included those with high academic marks, because students like to vote. Students. Uh,
So strangely,
they
despite the
like to,
red tagging, many
the
intellectuals.
Scout had three types of members: those with high academic marks, those who were good writers, so that they can write for the collegian. And then the third one would be those whom we call the natural leaders. They were already leading sororities and fraternities and other campus organizations. And then when it was time to mobilize thousands of people against the CAFA and against the witch hunt, no? Well, the United Front policy was applied. So all the campus organizations were convened, and the decision was made to storm the Congress with 5,000 students. So, and but the most important is the justness of the cause. These people in power are corrupt. They are brutal. They make use of the military, and they steal from the public resources and so on. All those anti-communists, no, conducting a cywar and even resorting to violent campaigns of suppression. They fail because they're selling a stinking product. No, they're selling the system which is exploiting and oppressing the people. No, so what is more attractive among the youth who are open-minded, who have fresh minds, than going for the national independence and for the Philippines, and the having democracy, economic development, social justice, and so on. And you have all these rotten classes of the big compradors, landlords, and bureaucrat capitalists lording over the people. So it's because of the justness of the cause of the KM that the KM became very attractive. And of course, the show of courage through protest mass actions was quite attractive to the youth.
Okay, thank you so much. So that's the lesson. Huh? Despite the red tagging, the membership went on strongly. Now, in your experience, will KM still sustain its strength and flow of membership until now?
Yes, the KM is practically the youth organization of the revolutionary movement, no? And so, of course, going underground and doing more work among the urban poor and rural poor communities, they get more members, no? There are higher proportions of membership of the working class and the peasantry. Then let's say the proportion of students, because the student population is not as big as the class population of young workers and peasants.
Okay. So there are two more questions on the line, and then we'll finish. But okay, so that's the lesson. Despite the attacks, we still sustain. And KM still has a strength, and the flow of membership is even stronger. There was a Kabataang Barangay and the Sangguniang Kabataan, or the SK, as political organizations. How do these organizations fare against Kabataang Makabayan? What can you say about these organizations comparably to KM?
In the time of Marcos, as in the subsequent regimes until now, the reactionary government tries to make use of the local government, no? The Sangguniang Barangay, that is supposed to be the local organ of administration or government, and then since there was the conspicuous role of KM as an opposition force, in fact a revolutionary force against the Marcos administration, there was an attempt to put up to use Kabataang Barangay and the Sangguniang kabataan against the KM and against the entire
SPSP,
current
yeah.
of the National Democratic Movement um, uh, in the whole country among the youth. But right away, the Filipino youth saw us rotten. Imagine Amy Marcos being the leader of this sort of youth organization. So it shows right away the daughter of the president.
Presidential
And then you
daughter.
have the Trajano case, just because a student in
Yeah.
Mapua University raised the question, how come you are the head of Kabatang Barangay, Then he ordered his
Balat sibuyas.
bodyguards from the military to snatch
Pick him
the
up.
poor
Pick up
guy,
Trano.
Trajano, and tortured and killed him. And this is a settled case in the U.S. Because the case of Trajano was brought up, and the U.S. court decided, that indeed this fellow was a victim of human rights violation, no less than torture and murder, and that's why Amy cannot go to the U.S. Uh, just like the rest of the
Yeah.
family, of course, not being able to go because they are all liable for some $2 billion as their as compensation for the victims of human rights violations under the Marcos regime. No? So, but so the reactionaries use the framework of the local government. But this is how the revolutionary movement responds. You should understand how the revolutionary movement takes into account these conditions.
Okay.
So, what the revolutionary movement does is to organize its own organs of political power and its own revolutionary organizations at the village level and at higher levels. But then they make friends. Although these organs and organizations of the barangay under the reactionary government tend to be conservative because there are rich peasants, no? And sometimes some small landlords in the village, because they have the means to entertain people, they can be popular. But their interests are not as big as the interests of the big landlords, and the big compradors. So you can apply united front tactics. Okay, you um, you be you appear as the ones in charge of the village, of the barangay, no? And whenever the GRP officials and the military come, you face up to them, no? And as much as possible try to avoid your being engaged in some corrupt some rackets, no? Like making the community appear as surrenderers, or let's say, and so that money can be supposedly disposed under e-clip, no? But actually the money is
Yeah.
pocketed by the
False
military,
positive
no?
surrenders.
Oh,
Yeah.
they will say, oh, we have some development program, and if you declare the NPA, the Revolutionary Movement, as
False positive.
as
Okay.
persona non grata or whatever, then you will get some monetary rewards. But actually, the money goes to this corrupt bureaucrats, bureaucrats at higher level and the military officers. So, the revolutionary movement knows how to deal with this right from the beginning. In Tarlac, the movement has to act in such a way that it can handle the tactics of the reactionaries. And the class composition of the organs of local government on the revolutionary side, the class composition would make the poor peasants and workers, the farm workers, as the main as the basis, you know? And the rich peasants are treated as allies, but they are not put in positions of, they can be in the official barangay of the reactionary government. Landlords are definitely out. No? Some local landlords residing in a village, sometimes there are, you know, owners of the 50 hectares or so, they don't have to work anymore. No? They just use tenants, you know. They are kept out of the local organs of political power of the revolutionary movement. So, you know, the revolutionary movement has a class line in creating organs and organizations, organs of political power and mass organizations. So um, um, the organs of power, which you may call the barangay, the sangguniang barangay that way, they are not really organs of the people, no? It is merely a means for the reactionaries to give down orders, and they don't serve the interest of the peasants, you know. So the military, for instance, oh, we bring it not for the NPA. We would have brought a lot of money and projects to the barangays all over the country. But actually, without class struggle, without revolution against the landlords, if really roads and bridges are going to be made, those roads and bridges and other facilities will benefit the landlords, not the not the poor peasants. No, so that's how ineffective all this propaganda being circulated, especially in social media and also in the corporate print and electronic media, that finally it's the military, not the civilian agencies, that is supposed to be bringing all these projects for the development of villages. So that's a big lie. And the Senate investigation has demonstrated that the military has not really done much, has practically done nothing in order to carry out projects, that have been previously approved, and now they ask, and then they ask for 28 billion additional money for their corruption. So that's a pitiful situation in the Philippines, with Duterte running a regime of terror and greed, a regime of state terrorism and plunder.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. So it's very clear. If we speak of KM is an organ of political power because, as qualified by Professor Sison,
It is a mass
it's an organization
supporting the
Yeah.
local organs
The
of political
people.
power.
The masses, the peasants particularly, the struggling Filipino people. So that makes it an organ of political power. Whereas Kabataang Barangay and Sangguniang Kabataan, these were just institutions for the political purpose of the bureaucracy and the ruling class. Okay, we're down to the last question, Professor. You still remember Lapiang Malaya was massacred in 1967, right? Was it because of CPP support that they were attacked? Or were you not threatened by that? And what was your reaction at that time?
No, the Lapiang Manggagawa had no connection with the CPP. Neither had it a connection with the Kabataang Makabayan, which was then existing.
Lapiang Malaya.
Huh?
Lapiang Malaya.
Excuse me, did I say Lapiang
Manggagawa?
Manggagawa? Sorry. Lapiang Malaya was some group with some religious motivation, and they were raising their bolos, against the government in Pasay, their headquarters was in Pasay. And like Duterte trying to show off, what violence is capable of, Marcos thought that shooting down the Lapiang Malaya leaders and members in Pasay would demonstrate that he's capable of using force. He's a strong man, you see. No? It's the same crazy notion that Duterte has that if he kills tens of thousands of supposed drug suspects who are arbitrarily listed, then he would come out as a strongman to be feared by everyone, no? And he could turn against the revolutionary movement subsequently. And that was his thinking. So that was Marcos killing the Lapiang Malaya leaders and members to show off his supposed role as a strongman. So, but you know, that served as a warning to those who would stand for the just cause of the people to be alert, no? And to be ready to fight Marcos with arms, because he's a dangerous man. That's what Duterte does, you know, because he shows us he's crazy enough to go to any extent of violence. People are prepared to fight him to any extent necessary in order to make sure that he's thrown out of power, including his mad successors, the Marcos and Duterte successors. That's what I call the mad successors. You can expect terrorism and more thievery, more plunder if these successors of Duterte will take power.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. We are already done for today's episode, the Philippine Youth Movement Then and Now. So thank you so much to our speaker, the chairperson emeritus of the International League of People's Struggle, Professor Jose Maria Sison. I would like to thank the audience for listening and paying attention to this program. I hope that the next Andy Line online will also have you around. Thank you so much and good afternoon. Professor Sison, would you like to give some last?
Thank you for having me, and I hope that I can be your time in any time in order to discuss important issues. I'm always ready and happy to perform the role of sharing my ideas and practical proposals sometimes. So I would like this check the ND online school going on for as long as necessary.
Kami ang kabataang makabayan, isig ng manggagawa at magsasaka, lakas at pag